Hello, everyone, and welcome to another useful and important session here at the Easy English Stories home channel. I'm so excited to dive into one of the most crucial aspects of language learning: input. Yes, you heard me right, input, and it's not just a technical term. It's a key ingredient to mastering English, or any language for that matter. In today's podcast, we're going to explore the meaning of input in English learning, why it matters so much, and how you can use the right kinds of inputs to learn English faster than ever before. Whether you're a beginner struggling with where to start or an advanced learner looking to polish your skills, this episode is packed with actionable tips and strategies that you can start using today. In today's world, we have more access to English input than ever before. But here's the catch. Not all input is created equal. Some types of inputs will speed up your learning, while others might just slow you down. So, today's goal is to help you identify the best inputs for fast English learning, explain the science behind why these inputs work, and give you practical tips on how to incorporate them into your daily routine. This session is for anyone who's ever struggled to find the best way to practice their English. Maybe you're overwhelmed by all the resources available online, or maybe you've been studying for a while, but you're not seeing the progress you expected. The truth is, not all language inputs are created equal. Some can be incredibly helpful, while others, though interesting, won't push your skills in the right direction. By the end of this session, you'll have a clear idea of what kinds of inputs you should prioritize, how to use them effectively, and why they're so crucial for your brain to process and retain the language. We'll also dive into the scientific reasons behind why some methods work better than others. So, if you're ready to learn how to fill your brain with the best English inputs, grab your notebook, settle in, and let's dive into it. What is input in language learning? Before we get into what the best inputs are for learning English fast, we need to understand what input really means in the context of language learning. Input refers to any exposure you get to the language. It's the listening, the reading, the watching, and even sometimes the observing that you do as part of your learning process. Let me break it down a little further. When you're learning English, you're essentially training your brain to recognize patterns, sounds, vocabulary, and sentence structures. All of this happens when you receive input. You can think of it like this. Your brain is a sponge, and every time you listen to an English conversation, watch a movie in English, or read an article, your brain is soaking up language. This exposure is what helps you understand how English works and how to use it. But not all input is equally effective. Let's say you're just starting to learn English, and you decide to watch an advanced-level documentary. The content might be interesting, but if you can't understand most of it, your brain isn't going to process much of the language. Compare that to listening to an English podcast that's specifically designed for beginners, where the host speaks slowly, uses simple words, and explains everything clearly. Now your brain can start to pick up on new words, phrases, and grammatical structures because the input is comprehensible. That's a key term. I want you to remember: comprehensible input. Comprehensible input is language that is slightly above your current level, but not so difficult that you can't understand it. It's the sweet spot for language learning because it challenges you just enough to push your boundaries without overwhelming you. To give you a concrete example, let's imagine you're at an elementary level in English. You could try listening to an English podcast about daily life where the host describes things like their morning routine or what they like to eat for breakfast. This is something you can mostly understand, and every time you listen, you'll pick up new words and phrases. On the other hand, listening to a business negotiation in English might be too advanced for you at this stage, and you wouldn't get as much out of it. Why input is crucial for fast language learning. So why is input so important, and why does it matter so much for learning English quickly? Well, think about it this way. Input is what builds your understanding of the language. It's the fuel that powers your ability to speak, write, and even think in English. The more high-quality input you get, the more exposure your brain has to the structure of the language, the common phrases, and the vocabulary that native speakers use. Research shows that learners who focus on getting regular, meaningful input in a language make faster progress than those who rely on traditional methods like grammar drills or vocabulary lists alone. This is because input gives you context. When you hear a new word in a sentence, you can often guess its meaning based on the words around it. You're learning words. In context, which is much more powerful than trying to memorize a list of isolated vocabulary. For example, let's say you hear the word amazing in this sentence. The movie was amazing. I really enjoyed it. Even if you've never heard the word amazing before, you can probably guess that it means something positive because it's used to describe the movie, and the person also said they enjoyed it. This is how your brain naturally picks up new language through input. And here's a fun fact. According to language acquisition expert Stephen Krashen, input accounts for about 90% of your language learning. That's right, 90%. Speaking and writing are important, but they come after you've had enough exposure to the language. So, if you want to learn English fast, you need to prioritize getting the right kinds of input into your daily routine. Why inputs matter in language learning? Let's start by talking about why inputs matter so much when you're learning a language. Think of it like this. Your brain is like a sponge. Whatever you feed it with, it absorbs. If you feed it with the right kinds of information, your learning process speeds up. But if you give it random or unfocused materials, it can slow you down. Let's break it down. Imagine you're trying to learn English, but you're mostly watching movies or listening to songs that don't have clear dialogues, or the content is too difficult for your level. What happens? Your brain gets some exposure to English, sure, but the effect isn't as powerful. Now, compare that to watching a TV series or listening to a podcast where the dialogue is clear and the topics are relevant to what you want to learn. In this case, your brain is actively processing useful inputs, learning how sentences are structured, absorbing vocabulary and context, and understanding the rhythm of the language. It's like building a house. You wouldn't start with random materials, some bricks here, some wood there, and hope it turns into a solid structure, right? You need a strong foundation, the right building blocks, and a plan. That's exactly what inputs do for your English learning. They build the foundation of your language skills, giving you the tools to understand and communicate better. The difference between passive and active inputs. Now, when we talk about inputs, it's important to understand that not all inputs are the same. There are two main types of language inputs, passive and active. Both are important, but they serve different purposes. Passive inputs are things like listening to music in English, watching movies, or even browsing social media posts in English. These inputs are happening around you, and you're not necessarily engaging with them on a deep level. They're great for getting your brain used to the sound of English, picking up some new words here and there, and staying connected to the language. But here's the key. Passive inputs alone won't be enough to get you fluent. You need active inputs, too. Active inputs are when you're actively focused on what you're learning. For example, listening to an educational podcast and taking notes, reading an article and trying to summarize it in your own words, or watching a TED Talk in English and then discussing it with a friend. These are activities where your brain is actively processing the information, and that's where real progress happens. Let me give you an example. I had a student named Maria from Brazil. She loved watching American TV shows and listening to English songs, but after months of exposure, she felt like her English wasn't improving much. That's because most of her learning was happening through passive inputs. When we switched to more active methods, like summarizing what she watched, repeating phrases out loud, and even shadowing the dialogues from her favorite shows, she started to notice a dramatic improvement. It's all about balance, but active input should be a bigger part of your learning process if you want to see real progress. The best inputs for learning English fast. Now that we've covered the difference between passive and active inputs, let's talk about where to find the best active inputs. And remember, the goal here is to find materials that not only challenge you, but are also at your level. 1. Listening to English. Listening is one of the most powerful ways to get input because it mimics the natural way we learn our first language. Here are some of the best listening inputs you can use. Podcasts, just like the one you're listening to right now. Podcasts are a fantastic way to get active input. Choose podcasts that are focused on English learning or those that discuss topics you're interested in. One of the best things you can do is listen to a podcast, take notes, and then try to explain what you learned to someone else. You can even try summarizing the key points in English. Podcasts are great because you can listen to them anywhere, while you're driving, cooking, or even exercising. Try to find podcasts designed for English learners or those that match your level. Some of my favorites include The English We Speak from the BBC and Luke's English Podcast, which caters to different levels. YouTube channels for English learners. There are countless YouTube channels aimed at helping English learners. Look for channels that explain grammar points, focus on pronunciation, or provide vocabulary building lessons. The key is to engage with the content by pausing, repeating what you hear, and practicing along with the video. Audiobooks. Audiobooks are another fantastic way to get listening input. Choose books that interest you, but make sure they're not too difficult. Start with beginner-level books if you're just starting out, and gradually work your way up to more advanced material. TV shows and documentaries. While watching English TV shows and documentaries can sometimes be passive, you can turn it into an active learning experience by using subtitles, pausing to repeat sentences, and even writing down new words. A good tip is to start with shows that you've already watched in your native language, so you can focus more on the language than the plot. Second reading in English. Reading is another excellent source of input because it allows you to see how English is structured. Here are some reading materials you can use. Graded readers. These are books specifically designed for language learners. They come in different levels, so you can find one that's perfect for you. As you read, underline new words, write down interesting sentences, and try to summarize the chapters to check your understanding. These are books specifically written for English learners. They come in different levels, so you can pick a book that matches your current ability. As you read, underline new words, write down sentences you find useful, and try summarizing each chapter in your own words. Online articles. Websites like BBC Learning English or Voice of America offer articles and news stories written in simple English, making them a great resource for learners. Books in your favorite genre. If you love mystery novels, find one in English that matches your level. The more interested you are in the material, the more motivated you'll be to continue reading. Third, interactive learning. While listening and reading are great, sometimes you need interactive input to push your understanding further. Here are a few ways to get that. Language exchange platforms. Apps like HelloTalk or Tandem allow you to chat with native English speakers. These conversations are real-life examples of how English is used, giving you authentic input in a natural context. English learning apps. Apps like Duolingo, Memrise, and Babbel can provide interactive exercises that challenge you to understand the language actively. They focus on both vocabulary and sentence structure, which gives you well-rounded input. How to use input effectively? Now that we've talked about the best inputs, let's go over how to use them effectively. Because just exposing yourself to English isn't enough. You need to make sure you're engaging with the input in a meaningful way. Here are some strategies to help. 1. Repetition. Don't just listen to a podcast once or read an article one time. Revisit the same materials multiple times to ensure that the language sticks. According to research, you need to encounter a new word about 7 to 10 times before it becomes part of your active vocabulary. 2. Shadowing. This is a technique where you listen to a sentence and then immediately repeat it out loud. It's a great way to practice pronunciation and intonation while reinforcing new words and phrases. 3. Summarizing. After reading a book chapter or listening to a podcast, take a few minutes to summarize what you've learned. This will help reinforce the input and check your understanding. The importance of repetition and consistency. One of the biggest mistakes learners make is jumping from one resource to another without mastering the input they're working on. Repetition is crucial. When you're listening to a podcast, don't just listen once and move on. Listen again and again until you feel like you can understand most of it without much effort. Let's talk numbers here. According to research, when you encounter a new word or phrase, you need to be exposed to it at least 7 times before it sticks in your memory. That means repetition isn't just useful, it's essential. Whether it's repeating the vocabulary you've learned, revisiting old podcasts, or going over previous lessons, the more you repeat, the stronger those connections become in your brain. Conclusion. Take action on the best inputs. To wrap things up, remember that input is the foundation of your English learning journey. Whether you're listening to podcasts, reading books, or engaging in conversations, the kind of input you get will determine how quickly and effectively you learn English. Make sure to choose inputs that are both interesting and comprehensible to keep you motivated and on track. So, take action today. Pick one of the input sources I've mentioned and start incorporating it into your routine. Even dedicating just 30 minutes a day to listening or reading in English can make a huge difference over time. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's session of the Easy English Stories Home. If you found this session helpful, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend who's also learning English. Let's keep growing together, one step at a time.